Recording. Awesome. Recording started. Okay, great. Thanks everyone for joining today. This is our community call number 71. Today I'll be your host. I'm Nimide. I'm a contributor in the community. For today's agenda, we'll have a DaprCon update. Then we'll go ahead and do a milestone overview. And then we'll end out with walking through the document store proposal and then some discussion, open discussion. So let's start off with the DaprCon update. Okay, so I know everyone's already heard of this, but DaprCon is happening this year. It's going to be happening next week as part of KubeCon. It'll be a full day event from 9 to 5 on Tuesday, October 25th. So if you're going to be at KubeCon in person, go ahead and you can find DaprCon in the schedule for Tuesday. You can go ahead and look at what's going to be there and you can attend in person. That being said, I did want to just make sure that I clarify with everyone. So we've learned from CNCF that they will not be streaming DaprCon to virtual attendees of KubeCon. So what that means is that only in-person attendees of KubeCon can see DaprCon live. However, we will have the video from DaprCon posted 24 hours later, and you'll be able to find that on our YouTube page, so you won't miss any of that content. But I just wanted to clarify, since we did have people who were trying to view DaprCon with the virtual registration, that won't be possible. Before I move on, I do want to open the floor to questions around this, just to make sure everyone's clear before we move on. Okay, in that case, we'll go ahead and move to our next topic. So next topic is going to be on our 1.10 release milestone overview. Yaron, do you want to share your screen? Awesome.
I will. Just a sec. I am going to start sharing in just a second here. And let me know when you can see it.
Yep, we can see.
All right, cool. So this is a review for the Dapr repository 1.10 milestone, and they're going to be reviewing the entire milestone now. So this covers the main center of gravity for the Dapr project, which is Dapr. This is where most of the other features that make their way into other repositories come from, but this is by no means inclusive. So this doesn't cover components, contrib, or the CLI, which are equally as important because they make up the greater user experience for Dapr. So for those of you who don't know, we basically track milestones that contain the main features and bugs that are going to go into a release in these milestones. So you can find these milestones on every release. If you want to see basically what the main things are that are going to go in. Of course, these milestones are being triaged. Whoops, what happened here? These milestones are being triaged on a continuous basis. So we meet Dapr maintainers every Monday to do a continuous triage process. That meeting is not open to the public, but we do have release meetings that are on Tuesdays. And so my ask for the greater community is, if you see an issue that you think should be or you want it to be in a Dapr milestone, you can either ping maintainers or ping on the issue and ask for that issue to be triaged into the 1.10 milestone, preferably with an explanation of why you think that should be triaged. You know, especially if it's a feature. If it's a bug, then we basically label these as P0 or P1. If it's a P0, it's basically, you know, a patch that's going to go into the other previous Dapr releases. But if not, it's going to be labeled as P1 or P2. P1 means that probably it'll make its way into the currently triaging milestone. So this is the Dapr milestone, and I'm just going to very briefly go over the main ticket items here that we have. But that's mainly, you know, to get you all familiar with how we triage things and when we do that and how we make sure that, you know, things are getting more visible to the greater community. So one major thing we have here. Oh, and by the way, this milestone was triaged mainly by Arthur and me. So Arthur, if you're on the call, please feel free to jump in at any moment.
Hey, Yaron, just a quick question. So would it be possible for you to also, once you kind of pick the big items from here, look at the planning milestone that has like the really big cross-cutting features as well?
Yeah, maybe we can do that first, actually.
Awesome.
So if we go to issues, there is the release planning issue here, which is always pinned. So if you go to issues, where you'll find it is here on the top right corner. This one's always pinned, as I said, and this basically contains the milestone dates, the release team. We are incorporating a new release process for Dapr, which is meant to be more open so that anyone from the community can basically go up to the release team and be a release shadow, which will allow them to become release leads and other roles from the release, going forward. So you can read more about it here. This is a very good document that's been contributed by Mark Fossil. Thank you. And you can see the release dates here, the initial feature proposals that we have, and as very verbosely meant here or expressed here, this impacts several milestones or repositories. This is not a complete list. I don't know, we might decide to change this list or even remove it. But here you can actually find all of the milestones that make up the Dapr release project. And so if you have any specific questions about the entire release in its entirety, you can comment here on the issue. And the release team looks at this issue, the maintainers look at this issue. So I'm going to go back to the Dapr milestone here, which is what Arthur and I are triaging on a weekly basis. And we have the configuration API that we want to make stable. Supporting UDS in Windows, we'll see about that. I think it should be actually supported. Supporting dynamic subscriptions. So today, when you subscribe and unsubscribe to topics, you basically need to restart your application to take effect, because you either write it into your code if you're using programmatic subscriptions, or you're updating the CRD. And this is really disruptive to applications, but supporting dynamic and dynamic subscribes and unsubscribes open up a whole new world of features for you. And also it means that there's minimal disruption to your application as it's running. I'm going to only mention this bug here. This is something that has to do with how Dapr labels Prometheus metrics. So today there's high cardinality, meaning, for example, if you're using service invocation and you have an endpoint in your application that has a dynamic path to it, Dapr will basically create metrics for all possible combinations. So this might lead to hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of cardinal URLs in the path, which means that there's very high costs for egress here, especially if you're sending those metrics out of the cluster. So what we want to take a look at is how we can, configure the cardinality of these metrics. And Arthur has a good proposal there. So, if you're suffering from this problem, please take a look at that. Next one is extending Dapr service invocation to non-Dapr endpoints. This is basically to have Dapr be able to use Dapr service invocation with non-Dapr endpoints and get tracing metrics, security, and the resiliency features. This is another issue worthwhile looking at, which is to support cloud events for the protobuf binary format as specified by the cloud events specification. We're not yet clear about how we're going to do this, but we're taking a look. So if anyone is very familiar with the cloud event binary format and they can help us, figure out what the right thing is to do here, that would be very appreciated. This is pretty much the same. And yeah, I think this is mainly it. So one other really big one is the workflow building block and engine, which we would really want to get into 1.10. This is big work that's being driven by John and Chris Gillum from the Dapr community. Thank you for that. And so if you really want to have, a say as community members about how the APIs are going to look at, or give feedback about the SDKs or anything else, then please take a look at this proposal. This is really important for us. So yeah, I think these are the main ones. And of course, we have what we're going to talk about right now, which is the document store building block. The rest on here are mostly bugs and features. So the document store building block is really important because it's going to open up the Dapr state management capabilities into newer ground. So one feedback that we've been getting ever since we released the state management building block is, key value is great. It's really useful for many scenarios, but how do I do, semi-structured data for it, or even queries upon non-structured data. So the document store building block is going to provide this native experience for many of these. And yeah, so this is mainly it. We have one other feature that we moved from Dapr 1.9 to 1.10, which is Dapr pub sub bulk operations, which are meant to improve performance greatly if you want to have very low latency, high throughput scenarios for pub sub. So there's a whole discussion on how the API is going to look like there. So please take a look at that too. And yeah, I think we can move on to talk about the document store API, which is a major feature for 1.10. So unless there are any questions or comments, I think we can move on. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Sounds good. Any questions on anything Yaron has just discussed? Cool. In that case, we'll go ahead and move on. So the next topic we're going to cover will be the document store proposal. Bern, do you want to just go ahead and share your screen?
Yeah, I'll do that. 1 second.
And then before you jump into the proposal, would you mind giving just a little bit of context on the, oh, yeah, if you just wanted to give a little bit of context and then jump in.
Yeah, for sure. Well, as you know, Dapr state management today, what we have is essentially a key value store. Though if I actually bring up the matrix of features, you can see some of Dapr state stores have additional capabilities and functionality. And it's a bit confusing sometimes to know while we expose this through what we call feature keys, capabilities essentially, it is still kind of confusing knowing when can you use query on state store. And that's also only possible if you happen to store the data with the right content type. And so even as a maintainer, it gets very complex to maintain things or troubleshoot issues because sometimes features like query can only be used for a subset of use cases for the state store component, because, for instance, you must have stored the data using JSON instead of some binary format, for example, and the state store might support multiple such content types. So that's one of the big things. There are capabilities the state store API also doesn't expose right now. For instance, you could imagine, since in document stores, typically you have, I'll actually jump to the proposal for a second. In document stores, you typically have data structured in some sort of maybe JSON way. That is a typical representation. And you might want to do partial updates of documents, not replacing entire documents. And there's just no good way to do that in the state store API as it is designed today. And having, as one of the maintainers of components contrib, having seen all kinds of reports of issues related to especially the query API and which often stem from either the data not having been stored in the right content type, or various other issues that are just implementation problems. Having seen those, it became clear that all those databases that support documents, that really should be its own building block, and that would allow us to expose other APIs or have better designed APIs specifically for documents. And I've looked at a couple of document stores out there. So what you see on the screen now in this proposal, if anyone wants to look at it, it's issue number 5146 in the Dapr repo. And please feel free to comment on here. This is not final yet. So you can see common operations I discovered by doing some research are essentially, being able to get documents by key, getting multiple at once, creating the document, replacing an entire document, of course, deleting. And then noteworthy is really the querying of documents by some sort of query filter. So this can be based on sub properties. You do matching based on nested properties in the document. And we have to get a bit more into the details of that. And updating a document is similar. And that's, I think, really interesting for these document stores, where you should be able to say, something like update all the documents where a certain condition matches, and then only update these nested properties. The often common use cases are removing a certain field from those documents, or adding a certain field, or updating a value of a nested property. Something, of course, totally impossible with the state store as it exists today. And as an aside, I should mention today, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, but our state store as it is today, it is for the most part a key value store. And so one confusion we constantly encounter is that the term state store, state management, is a bit overloaded at the moment, because it is primarily a key value store. And so having this document store state management type, I suppose, a new building block, hopefully makes that clearer. And I would position the current state store as a key value store. And so if you want to understand the difference, that's the key value store. Now we're adding a document store. There is related a proposal currently to add specifically blob store related capabilities. It's still a bit unclear to me from the proposals whether this means a new building block or whether it means enhancing state store to add essentially yet again another column to this here as the capability. That's in discussion still, not final, and I'm not covering here, but something to keep in mind. The idea of state management is ever expanding. It's all work in progress, so please do provide your feedback on that proposal as well. Now, going back to this document.
Bernd, sorry,
Pardon?
just to jump in real quick. We also have a proposal to discuss SQL building block.
Or, yeah. Do you remember what that issue is?
I'm going to find it and paste it in chat, but it's definitely, as part of the family of state management proposals.
Yes, that's something that comes up a lot too, being able to perform SQL queries. And perhaps with that in mind, in the future, perhaps somebody could go as far as building a plugin there for ORMs or things like that. Who knows? The sky's the limit, I suppose. But I've seen that request a lot come in as well for the more SQL API or capabilities. Okay, so with document stores, one common representation of documents is JSON, but also one problem that we've encountered with the query API today, and then specifically in state store. For example, in the case of Mongo, a lot of users were surprised that data types aren't retained. And JSON is actually a lossy format. JSON, by the JSON spec, the difference between an integer, if I take the number 2, submit it, you think it's an integer, but it's actually stored as a decimal, but it just doesn't have any decimal place. There's nothing, there's no difference in the spec between integer and decimal numbers. And so the data type, for instance, can't be retained there. And so one format that MongoDB uses, for instance, is BSON, which I guess stands for binary something. I don't know. I guess not binary JSON, but whatever the SON part stands for. So looking into that, the idea here is also every document store that does have the capability of storing types for the various properties in a document. Every such state store, we should be able to expose the capability to, what you put in is what you get out, including the whole types of those fields as well. And so for that, we will be using BSON as one of the supported content types. So you can still submit JSON, but BSON is the preferred way then. And in the case, of course, where a document store would not support BSON, we just in the implementation translate it to JSON and then it's stored that way. That brings up also one consequence is that for the SDKs, there will be work for all of us to add support for BSON. But that is, we will have to figure out how that will look. So I listed some consequences here, though. One thing we've also seen, and this is especially something I feel passionate about as a maintainer of components contrib, is personally, I am not in favor of making the current query API in the state store stable. In fact, it just doesn't feel like it belongs there, given, like I showed before, this complexity of only a subset of state store support query. And that doesn't even work in general. It only works, for instance, for Mongo. It only works if you chose the JSON content type when you created your document or stored some value. And if you chose a different content type, well, you can't even query this thing because we just store it as a binary value in the database. So it's simply too many special cases and such, and it's really difficult to maintain that as a maintainer. And so moving that API into the document store makes a whole lot more sense. And one thing we can also do here is the document store, and there are many comments on this document here. And one thing that we mention is we should be able to interact with data that was written from any source to the document store. In state store, we have an opinionated representation of the data. We essentially have some sort of envelope that we created that we store the state in. But in document store, there's not a need for such a thing. And that means we will be able to interact with data written to the document stores, databases from any source. And that should also enable additional use cases, hopefully. And the idea here also is, for any users of the query API today, at a minimum, we will want to create document stores for all those various databases so that the query capability will exist. It will just be moved to document store eventually. I'm thinking the current query API and state store will probably not be removed until document store becomes at least stable. So if someone is wondering about sort of the lifetime of the current query API and state store, that's probably what that's going to be. This is sort of, let's see, I'm going to call it work in progress, but just some ideas I had for how APIs might look. And you know, there would be, I didn't specifically list the request body and all the details there, but the APIs could be something along this line here. I'll make it a bit bigger. I don't know if collection is the way we would want this, but we don't need to necessarily limit ourselves to only being able to query a single table or collection or whatever it is called in the various document stores. We should be able to support writing to making that part of the API so you can interact with different tables or collections as well. Unless, and this is something to be decided, on a per component basis, we could certainly say that a component should be initialized to be limited to a particular collection. But I think in general, it would be nice to be able to have the one component interact with any number of tables and collections, which is also something that you cannot do in the state store right now. And let me jump ahead here a bit. Now, one of the other tricky things about this, okay, yeah, lots of back and forth. By the way, if there are comments and questions being answered, I try to update the proposal at the very top. So hopefully that should be a summary of some decisions. So let me go. I added some comments last night, some sort of open questions here, which, for instance, the query API itself, that part is a bit tricky because every document store has different query syntax, different capabilities. And the idea of the building blocks is, like, unlike bindings, which bindings, Dapr bindings, I consider, you know, generic, free for all. One thing is not like the other thing, which is almost why I think the term building block is maybe not applicable to binding, because that's actually not something where one thing can be replaced with another thing. But as far as this document store is concerned, of course, each document store should be interchangeable. So we need a common query language. And for now, what we could do is keep what we have in state store and move it over. But you can see that the query language is limited, right? So for instance, in languages like MongoDB, or not languages, but databases like MongoDB, you can do things such as searching for, let's say nested property, let's say order count greater than 5 or something like that. So there's a way to do such filtering, but we don't support that. And there are some reasons because some document stores might not support it in some way or another. So that's a bit of a dilemma, because we want a querying or filter language that can be used across all of the various document stores. But we also want our document store to be powerful enough. So there the question is, what do we think about allowing someone to additionally use the native query capability of that component, but knowing that doing so would not make the component interchangeable? So by default, you can use the Dapr query or Dapr filters, but if you choose to, maybe it's exposed via component metadata. I'm not sure yet on the details, but either traditionally the question would be, do we just introduce new bindings, and the bindings, each of them lets you use the raw query capabilities, or do we want this really to be part of the document store and it's sort of a flag essentially that says, I know what I'm doing. Yes, I don't care about compatibility with other document stores. Let me run this raw query with all the full capabilities. So that's one thing to be considered, because I do think our query language right now is quite limited. And we can have a discussion on that in a second, perhaps. And I'm almost done going through this. And let's see, another thing I was looking. No, I think that's primarily it right now. I have put some links here for what some of these APIs look like in different databases. One reason why the query language, for instance, is limited like this today. I know in the case of, for instance, Cosmos DB, data could be stored in multiple partitions, and querying across multiple partitions is only possible with a very limited sort of query filter set. And the moment you want to do more complex queries, you actually have to limit those to a particular partition of the data. And that's also a bit complicated to manage for a user, having to know what partition they wrote to and so on. So that might be a reason why expanding the query language may not be a great idea. And from an implementation perspective, of course, this query language has to be translated into each document store's native query language. So I'll jump into some of these. For example, here's Rethink DB. Where am I? Filter, what does it look like? So it looks like it's some sort of JSON where you just say, age is 30 or something like that. I haven't looked at the full capabilities here, but yeah, so age equals 30. I think they have greater than, yeah, this is similar, I think, in MongoDB, that they use a bit of a similar syntax, but in Mongo they do it in BSON. This is just the Go client, so they probably don't have examples here. Let me see, find, I think in find you can do that. Yeah, I mean, here's sorting, not querying necessarily, but they use BSON for that. In Cosmos DB, where's the filtering? Querying. It is some sort of, query language like this. So that's something, that's why we need this sort of generic query language that we have today, that we need to translate into the native query format. Yeah, so I mean, I would love to hear thoughts on sort of these capabilities, or what people are thinking. for document store, and especially around the needs people have with query capabilities. I think update will be nice if we get this right, but even for updating, whatever decision we make for the querying language, that will affect the updating as well, because here the idea again is you can say, you know, update all documents where a certain condition is the case, and then replace sort of the nested fields, or do some sort of action on nested properties in the document. But the filtering or the querying that's essentially implicitly happening is going to be the same as what is part of the query API. And does anyone have thoughts on this? I'll open the floor. I think this is the proposal for now. There are obviously details missing on the specific implementation on how the query should look. One thing I do think is in many of these document stores, there isn't even necessarily a distinction between getting a document and the finding. For instance, in Mongo, it's always find, you know, it's like usually find one or find multiple or something like that. It's always find, so querying is really the operation there. And you can specifically say as the condition that you're querying for the key. So here I put it this way: in some document stores, I did notice getting a document is really by an index, by some sort of primary key, and in querying, finding is, yeah, well, it's a query operation. In some document stores, there might not really be a distinction between those, but in others there is, and so it's okay. It's good to have this distinction here.
Maybe I missed this at the beginning here, but this is a new component type. Yes, it's not going to be added. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So this will be, for example, let me think the list here of components. Where did I wrote some of them somewhere. Let me see. There is, I might have deleted this accidentally, the list of components that would get this, but essentially everything you have today with the query column right here, CockroachDB should be able to support it, Mongo for sure, Postgres, I think, yeah, and Redis, JSON. For instance, like the AWS document store, that really uses Mongo. I looked at the documentation, so they use the Mongo driver. So essentially Mongo gives you both Azure Cosmos DB with Mongo driver and the AWS document DB. That's all just done by the Mongo component. Yeah, so everything that we have today, I think there's also, where's RethinkDB? That's actually interesting, because I think RethinkDB has query capability. It's just not listed here. Or I'm not sure if we implemented it, but it definitely has that capability.
Yeah, we didn't implement it.
Yeah. So
Bernd, I have a question. You brought up MongoDB as, you know, an implementation that's supported for both Cosmos DB and AWS Document DB.
yeah.
So in regards to the query language, the generic one that we might want to have for all component types, maybe do you think, like, what's your opinion about basically choosing the MongoDB query language?
I think so. My only problem with that is, I mean, I think that's good. The only problem is that actually the full feature set of that isn't supported across all the different document stores.
Right. So
I do think the Mongo one is really interesting, and I think it's really nicely structured. Let's bring that up actually. Let me see. Find, yeah, for instance, here, this example, they use this means less than or equal to.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, we don't have to support, you know, all of the query language, right? We need to support the main use cases. I think when Cosmos DB and Document DB also came out with their support, you know, they came out with a very limited, it's still limited to this day, number of features. So, you know, if we support that and we find a way to expand it after, that may be a good way. And yeah, I mean, there's other things. Lynn just posted in chat, you know, things like OData. So there might be existing standards, you know, we can look at, but otherwise, I think Mongo, because of its, you know, commonality for these types of data might be a good standard to try and lean on.
Yeah, I have not looked into OData, and honestly, it's not something the majority of these document stores even talk about at all. So I have not considered that. I work with so many open source document stores, and that's definitely not something that ever comes up there. So for me, it's not even on the radar.
Yeah, it's more of an query schema for an API than fetches data.
Right. Okay, for that, yeah, I'm not sure, because like I'm also very familiar with the Mongo way of doing it, and it's similar in things like RethinkDB. I do personally like the Mongo way. The question then is, let's suppose someone were to submit a query, and that query uses capabilities that a given document store doesn't have. I'll be okay with returning some sort of error and saying, unsupported query condition or something like that. Is that fine?
Yeah, I mean, that's what Cosmos DB and DocumentDB and other databases do when you do exactly that. So
yeah, as long as we're okay with not every Dapr state store supporting the full query language, because it's more a matter of how interchangeable do we want those
yeah, I think we should agree on what's the minimum required schema that we support is, right?
Yeah.
And it needs to be something that covers 60-70% of use cases, like mainstream use cases, right?
Unfortunately, I can only say that for Cosmos DB specifically, to do cross-partition queries, I recently had a discussion around that, and the minimum, like the only thing that can be supported to query across multiple partitions is actually a very limited query feature set. Otherwise, one has to query every partition individually. And I don't think the set is much richer than what is on the screen now, from what I saw.
On the other hand, though, this actually strengthens the point of not needing to support a very full query language.
Yes.
Although we would want to, of course, we don't want to limit ourselves, that the generic construct that we come up with shouldn't be limited by the underlying implementation. So
one idea is maybe taking what we have in query today, making that the minimum required set, but we can express those things through the sort of Mongo style query language, but still only require these current capabilities as the minimum. And then everything else we can optionally support.
There is a slight different approach if one goes take this deeper, which is, would it make sense for the document building block be simply the MongoDB API itself?
The document building block be the Mongo API?
Yeah, so any application today that uses MongoDB could, by changing the endpoint to point to the sidecar.
You're saying you don't want to support other document stores, only Mongo?
No. We support all the document stores, but our API is the Mongo API, and then we change behind the scenes of the layers.
I think essentially that's what we're saying, right? Like with the,
no. So what Arthur is suggesting goes deeper, because Arthur is actually suggesting a protocol support for MongoDB. So Arthur, do you mean, existing Mongo clients being able to connect to Dapr?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous idea. It's just like technically we're going to need to implement the Mongo protocol, which I mean,
it's a binary thing. It's not a REST or gRPC protocol.
Maybe we need to look into that, but
I think it is. Yeah.
So what I'm trying to say is, I think there is value in us keeping a simplified query in our API, and then if we want to have like the MongoDB flavor, I would rather implement the protocol itself and say, okay, here, if you want to enable DocumentDB API as Mongo, there might be a flag or configuration. You pass the port. And then from that time on, you talk the MongoDB protocol directly to Dapr sidecar.
But why not just use another SDK then? And just use another SDK that exists today, and then call it done. You'd have to use Dapr.
But you can use Dapr, but you can use Dapr to talk to other databases that are not MongoDB.
But Arthur, AWS Cosmos DB with Mongo driver and Azure Cosmos DB with Mongo driver and AWS Document DB, they already like literally tell you to use the Mongo driver, the Mongo SDK.
Yes, but what about other databases that don't talk to Mongo?
Yeah, that's why but then why do you want to support somehow using the Mongo driver to talk to Dapr, which then talks to the...
To get the answer to that is to get the other features like security tracing metrics, resiliency, all of that stuff, which isn't supported by the native SDK.
Yeah, but
Plus, if you've already written
how can you
code
expose that through the native SDK? But if you're saying use the native SDK to talk to Dapr, to then talk to, that's what I'm confused by.
Yeah. So if at the database, so the advantage is that you can talk to other databases that are not Mongo.
Using the Mongo client.
That don't have the Mongo API through Dapr, because Dapr will create that layer for you.
So you want to use them, but you're saying using the Mongo client, you want to use the Mongo SDK to talk to non-Mongo databases.
You can even use the Mongo client to talk to non-Mongo databases through Dapr that way. The reason I'm saying that is because I think it's kind of if we start to make our API mix and match with the MongoDB API, I think it's going to be kind of a little bit weird going through it. So okay, this part is done by Dapr. This time is this query now is copying Mongo. So I think it's we keep the consistency to say, oh, this is our query language, and we can say it is inspired by Mongo, but I don't think we should necessarily try to say, okay, make the query exactly what MongoDB does. Because to go that route, I rather create I rather create the API itself and say we are fully Mongo compatible, and the database that are not Mongo, we're going to make it Mongo compatible for you. They have a concept of cursor as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good direction to go if it's technically achievable, because like it's going to integrate with existing Mongo clients. Mongo is a standard enough protocol, I think, being supported in major cloud providers for Dapr to be able to standardize on. For people using just MongoDB, Dapr will still give them benefits, all the security tracing metrics and resiliency benefits that they don't get out of the box with just the Mongo client. And for people who need portability, they'll be able to use Mongo SDKs, which are tested against other data stores, of course, reading the limitations table and seeing that it might not support everything, but for the majority of use cases, maybe even it might work for cross database queries. So I think that's a good way to go. But as mentioned in the chat, there's like technical challenges and maybe even legal ones that we're going to need to take a look at if we want to do that. But generally, I'm supportive of that direction.
Okay, that's quite different from what was discussed before. Yeah.
That doesn't mean to say that I don't think we can do it with, creating our own generic API, which might be a copy of the MongoDB query API. That's a perfectly valid scenario too.
Yeah, and I think Mongo doesn't. There is no real API, right? Because there's no REST server. It's not a REST protocol. So
it's the schema. I meant the
right. Yes. Like that's why I kind of I named them generically, but I did mostly find inspiration in this in the Mongo client's functions, right? And then that's what I'm also most familiar with.
Okay. Yeah, I'm definitely biased with our current query API because I helped create that query language. So I kind of like it, but and I like the simplicity of it, even though I understand it doesn't support all the capabilities. But that's the debate that Bern mentioned. How complete and we want to be and lose compatibility across databases versus having a simple query. So
I think also our current query language does have a limitation, which is it's JSON, not BSON. And then again, if you want to really check if you wanted to say a particular attribute needs to be exactly this value, but also exactly this type, data type, that's not even possible with our query language today. So we would need to have a BSON or something version of that query language as well.
Yes, I agree with that approach. I think the BSON thing might be a requirement. Yes.
Yeah, if we implement the protocol, it will be for sure.
I think it's from a technical perspective. I mean, the Mongo protocol is some sort of binary protocol. I am trying to wrap my head around how we are going to do that. We're basically having to expose some sort of Mongo port in the sidecar that, and then somehow streaming requests in. I don't even know how we're becoming essentially, the sidecar has to become some sort of Mongo server that then translates things into a REST API or into our HTTP and gRPC APIs, which then makes calls and then somehow potentially streams the data through all this thing. It sounds very complex. Yeah.
Yes, it will be technically complex. I agree.
Yeah, and I'm also trying to make sure we understand what we're solving more though than just what you could do with a Mongo client anyway. So we have to be very clear on taking it back to the scenarios of why we're doing this. I think we need to ask the question why a little bit more for that thing.
Yeah, I think the main use case is what Bernd started with, which is to allow Dapr users using a multitude of databases, richer querying supports, those
Correct.
using document stores. And that's what we should be focusing on.
Yes.
Yeah, and also just as I mentioned today, the in-state store, it's just difficult. You can see there's a multitude of open issues around query API in the Dapr repo and contrib repo, often because people didn't store data with the right content type or something along those lines. I think having a document store, a dedicated building block where you know every component supports query and every component, the only way it can store data is in a manner that's that can be queried. I think it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, I also think we should enable native support in addition to the generic ones, because that also has benefits.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, right? So having a way to let me see where I mentioned it in my open questions somewhere. Having a way to use our abstraction for a query language, but also being able to use the full native query language somehow.
Yeah, you know what? Thinking about it, I think the major issues we're running with users today is not actually for portability. It's basically users coming and saying, hey, you know, I can write a key to Mongo with Dapr, but then I want a query, and then I have to fall back to the SDK because Dapr doesn't have a way for me to do that, right? And so it's less for portability. It's more about, you know, using Dapr for your queries as well as being able to save and, you know, mutate data. So I think having the native query there would definitely solve for that, where Dapr is your one-stop shop to interact with a database, getting all of the other Dapr benefits I mentioned earlier, and not needing to go back to the SDK. I think portability here might be less of an issue, even though we can generically solve for that too, even if it's a little, you know, limited on the number of constructs you can actually reach out to.
Yeah, makes sense. The native query is nice. Let me go back to this Mongo example here. Let me see. Is it on find? I'm looking. Is this sorting? Is this the finding? Yeah, maybe this one. This is how they're saying like get every document where the name is Bob, I guess. And I think for the native capability, maybe just passing through the query entirely, right? Not interpreting it, but really just passing it through. So in this case, you know, you send it as BSON, which is then supported in the SDKs, send it through, and it's in the case of, you know, Mongo, if it knows what to do with BSON, I mean, it will just pass it to the query parameter of the client, like somehow let the client interpret the query that's being passed through, right? If that's for the native support that we mentioned here, where you allow using the full feature set, coming up with some sort of interpretation in Dapr and then abstraction and whatever, that's difficult. We have already our generic query language. Yeah, again, I don't know how we are going to support both the native one and our abstraction properly. Need to look into that a bit. But if there are any thoughts on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think it can be as simple as just different APIs, like
Yeah,
native query / query, whatever.
yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks. I mean, this is a great proposal. I think this is going to advance Dapr state features in a pretty big way. We just need to think this through and really solve for the majority of use cases and the major pain points, which right now I think it's users who use Dapr to store state but can't query state, and then needing to drop to the SDK, and then just dropping Dapr altogether if they're using the SDK anyway. So yeah.
Yep, makes sense. Yeah, in terms of decision though, making or going forward, deciding on whether to expose the Mongo wire protocol, right? That's what it is. Somehow, how are we going to go about that? Whether we are sticking with our typical REST and gRPC APIs, or whether we are going to support the Mongo wire protocol.
At the very least, we should look into that possibility.
Yeah. It's going to be complex. I'm not yet sold on the benefit given the complexity, but we'll have to see. I'm certainly open to it, but hopefully some member of the community have more insight, and everyone watching this recording later, so people have insight into that and have ideas. But I definitely think that certainly means the sidecar would theoretically need to expose another port, run another server at that point. So something to keep in mind.
Yep. So George asked on chat, could you bolt in some existing wire protocol code as a pluggable component? Maybe.
The pluggable components, yeah, talk to the runtime, right? So you still interact with the current state, the current building block APIs, but then the requests internally are routed to the pluggable component, right? So it would still hit the runtime first. So the wire protocol would still have to be in the runtime.
Yeah, unless the component itself can actually open the server in some way, but we can try and look into that offline.
Yeah, the component. The
component can actually open the wire protocol server.
Sure, for sure. But then you're almost having a component. Then it's almost more like the Dapr component initialization helper component or something, like you're almost saying it's sort of like Docker Compose in Dapr or something, like spin up this thing and start the server.
Yes, that's definitely an implementation issue, but yeah. Interesting idea though, George.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, yeah, I think this is great. And please, everyone, make your opinions known on the issue. This is where we continue to discuss the feature and where we look at and where we will be updating once decisions are final.
Yep, indeed. The goal is for us to get this into 1.10, and then we mentioned it's not listed here, but we talked about having MongoDB being the first document store when we do implement this.
So at the moment, given that we're just starting 1.10 and this discussion of the Mongo protocol one, I presume that's not going to be, if you do anything in 1.10, you'll just stick to what you have here for now and keep it as an alpha, so it could change.
I think the protocol decision is like so big that I don't think that's a matter of like alpha or not. I think that would be too much of a breaking change there. I personally certainly would not want to begin implementing these REST APIs then decide, oh, we're going to use the Mongo alpha API. So I think that decision we should come to a consensus on before we start implementing anything.
And that's true for any issue, yes.
Yeah.
All right, I think we're at time.
Awesome. Well, that was a good discussion. If you, as was mentioned, if you want to add more to this discussion, please find the proposal and add your comments there. Do we have an idea for how long people have to kind of add their comments there until we're going to converge and start writing code for 110?
I think people can comment even after we converge and start coding.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I think it would be really good to have thoughts soon on just the protocol we want to use, because that is just a major architectural change or difference that would result in potentially an entirely wasted coding effort if coding had begun at that point. So I'd say, I don't know, arbitrarily, I'd say if at least on this protocol decision, we can decide within the next 2 weeks or so, that would be good. The details otherwise we can figure out as we go, but at least the protocol would be good to figure out in the next, let's say, 2 weeks.
Awesome. So if you have any top ideas on the protocol, add your commentary there within the next 2 weeks. Okay, well, we are at time, so I don't want to keep anyone for any longer. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks, Bern and Yaron, for sharing with the community.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.